By April 1988, I was 27 years old, single, working nights in a chocolate factory, borderline alcoholic, living with my grandmother, and a multiple murderer. It had been almost 10 years since my first kill, and by now I had basically no control whatsoever over my compulsions. I had stumbled across my first victim by pure chance, an 18-year-old hitchhiker thumbing for a ride on the side of the road, but now I was actively seeking out victims. On the night of April 23rd, I moved from bar to bar in downtown Milwaukee, having a few drinks and hopefully finding my next kill. Club 219 was a common hunting ground for me. In fact, this is where I would meet most of my victims. However, that night I had no luck convincing anybody to return to my place. Come the small hours of the following morning, I was getting ready to call it a night when my attention was drawn to a phone booth about half a block down from Club 219. There was a young guy who seemed kind of agitated in the booth. I watched him make a few calls, but it looked like whoever he was trying to reach wasn't picking up the phone. I'd seen the guy in Club 219 earlier that night. He'd been with some friends then, but now he was all alone. I made my move. When I approached the man, I could tell right away that he wasn't interested in me at all. I tried to start up a conversation, but he practically ignored me. It was obvious that he was waiting for me to take a hint and move on. With a last roll of the dice, I asked the guy what was bothering him. He told me that his car had broken down, and he was trying to get in touch with a friend to come in their car and give him a... Well, hey, my place isn't far from here, I tell him. All of a sudden, this guy seems very interested in me. He says that his name is Ron. I'm Jeff, I tell him. We agree to walk to my house so that I can get my car, and then I'll drive him back to his vehicle and hopefully jump-start it. Obviously, I have absolutely no intention of holding up my end of the bargain. We exchange some small talk. Ron tells me about his job working as a mental health counselor. I tell him that's a very important line of work. And when Ron asks me what I do for a living, I'm too embarrassed to tell him that I work as a mixer at a chocolate factory, so I mumble something about working in electronics. Ron doesn't seem to be genuinely interested, and thankfully he doesn't ask me to elaborate. Eventually, a cab pulls up, and we both get in, which is just as well, as I lied to Ron with regard to just how close my house was. It probably would have been about an hour's walk, but the cab does it in around 10 minutes. By now, Ron has made it clear to me that this isn't a hookup. I tell him that's absolutely fine. When the cab was about a block and a half from 57th Street, where my grandmother's house sits, I told the driver to pull over and let us out. I was already taking a big risk, as it was, by letting the cabbie see me and Ron together. I figured it best if he didn't know exactly where I lived. Ron and I got out and started walking. He seemed to be a little bit suspicious about why we didn't get dropped off at my front door, so I told him that I didn't want the cab to wake up my grandmother. This seemed to satisfy him, and so we kept walking. When we reached my grandmother's place, Ron said that he'd wait outside while I grabbed my keys. This was a critical moment. If Ron refused to come inside, then the whole night would be a waste. I told him real friendly that it was okay, he could come in and wait. I can't remember if he said anything, but he did come inside. My heart was racing at this point. After opening the front door, I reset the burglar alarm and stepped inside. Ron followed. I walked towards the stairs when suddenly somebody cried out, "Is that you, Jeff?" It was my grandmother. Her bedroom was on the ground floor, which was why she was able to hear me, even though I had done my best to be as quiet as possible. I marched over to her room, doing my best to hide my agitation from Ron, opened the door a crack and said, "Yeah, it's me, Grandma. I'm just making myself a cup of coffee." At this point, Ron told me that he really didn't have time for coffee. My worst fears came true when Ron started saying over and over again that he had to go. I always hate it when they say that. I had to think fast. How could I possibly convince Ron to stay? Maybe booze would work. I moved to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of Bailey's that I had stashed away in a cupboard, and offered him a drink. This only seemed to annoy him even more. He insisted upon leaving. I did my best to reassure Ron that I was just going to have a quick coffee. Then we could go and jumpstart his car. This seemed to placate him. Ron tells me that he likes cream and sugar with his coffee. Unfortunately for him, I also slipped in a little temazepam. He's in a hurry to leave, so he drinks his coffee quickly. That's absolutely fine by me. He gulps down the brew, never once complaining about a funny taste or anything like that. All I have to do now is wait, and then he's mine. Ron looks at me, and right before he drops to the floor, there is a moment of sheer terror on his part. Some sources state that the only reason Ron survived his encounter with me is because my grandmother collapses at my feet. There's probably a lot of truth in that, but I should probably point out that Ron looked like he weighed a good 250 pounds. It wouldn't be the easiest body to store or to get rid of, for that matter. Then there was the cab driver who had seen us together. If missing person posters with Ron's face on them started to spring up around town, it might not be too long before the cops came looking for me. So I decided that Ron would live. The next day I managed to rouse him and helped him onto a bus. But he was still in a stupor from the drugs that I had slipped into his coffee. He wasn't coherent at all, and it was obvious that he had no idea where he was or what was happening to him. A few days went by, and I hoped that by the time Ron came around, he'd have no recollection at all of ever meeting me or being in my grandmother's house. When the cops arrived at my door and asked me to answer a few questions down at the station, I thought I was done for. It turned out that Ron remembered basically everything that had happened right up until the moment he drank the spiked coffee. I told the cops that Ron was a liar. I said that he and I had been in a relationship and that we'd spent the entire night drinking, before an argument broke out between us. I told them that the next day Ron had been worse for wear, so I'd helped him onto a bus and bid him farewell. This was all hogwash, of course. At this point in my life, I already had a criminal record. The cops actually bought my story, and I was certain that the cops would take Ron's side. But almost unbelievably, or if they did believe Ron, decided that it was my word against his. One could argue in hindsight, though, that the police should have run a toxicology test on Ron. They might very well have found traces of the drug I'd used to incapacitate him still in his bloodstream, not to mention the fact that when he woke up in hospital, there was a ligature mark around his neck. Roughly a year later, I was getting into a cab outside Club 219 with a young man who was certain to be my next victim. Next thing I know, there's my old pal Ron standing beside us. He started telling the guy that I was crazy and warned him to get the hell away from me. I did my best to act dumb and told Ron that he must be getting me confused with somebody else. When he insisted that he knew I was the person who had drugged him, I offered to buy him a cup of coffee so we could discuss the matter further. In the end, I had to walk away, though. Apparently, when Ron last spoke with detectives about our encounter, he warned them that sooner or later I would strike again. On that count, Ron was absolutely right. But that's a story for another day.